Nothing has formally ended, and that is precisely the problem. There has been no treaty withdrawn, no alliance renounced, no dramatic announcement to signal a break. On paper, the relationship between the United States and Canada still looks intact. Borders remain open. Agreements remain in force. Officials continue to use the language of partnership, but beneath that surface, something foundational has shifted. The relationship now operates on assumptions that no longer hold, and once those assumptions collapse, repair becomes extraordinarily difficult. This wasn't about a single insult, a single tariff, or a single negotiation gone wrong. It was about a change in how power is applied and how trust is interpreted. For decades, the US-Canada relationship functioned on predictability. Disputes happened, but they were contained within a shared understanding of mutual dependence and restraint. That understanding has eroded. What replaced it is transactional pressure applied without regard for long-term alignment. When leverage is used not as a last resort but as a routine tool, the signal is unmistakable. Stability is conditional. The damage is irreversible not because cooperation is impossible, but because certainty is gone. Canadian policymakers no longer plan on the assumption that American behavior will be bounded by precedent. They plan for volatility. They hedge. They diversify. That shift is quiet but decisive. Trust, once lost at the strategic level, does not return through reassurances or friendly language. It returns only when incentives change, and those incentives have not changed. From Washington's perspective, pressure was meant to force compliance. From Ottawa's perspective, it revealed vulnerability. That asymmetry matters. Once a partner internalizes the lesson that dependence can be weaponized, the rational response is to reduce that dependence permanently. This is not retaliation, it is adaptation. And adaptation, once embedded in policy, outlives any single administration. The climax of this rupture is not confrontation, but distance. Coordination becomes cautious. Alignment becomes conditional. Decisions that once would have been automatic now require risk assessments. Every interaction is filtered through a new question. What happens if this is used against us later? That question alone is enough to change behavior across trade, energy, security, and diplomacy. It slows cooperation without stopping it. It weakens integration without breaking it. This is why the absence of a formal break is misleading. Formal breaks can be reversed. Structural mistrust cannot. The relationship still functions, but it no longer rests on shared confidence. It rests on calculation. And relationships governed by calculation rather than trust are inherently brittle. They survive, but they do not recover their former depth. The resolution is not collapse, but permanence. A new baseline has been set. The United States and Canada will continue to work together where interests overlap, but the assumption of inevitability is gone. What was once taken for granted now requires justification. That is the point of no return. Not because cooperation ends, but because the relationship that existed before cannot be restored under the same terms. What comes next is a thinner, more cautious coexistence, and that shift carries consequences far beyond this bilateral relationship. What changed was not the existence of disputes, but how they were handled. The United States and Canada have always had friction. Trade disagreements, regulatory fights, political posturing, none of this was new. What made this moment different was the shift from managing disputes within a shared framework to applying pressure without regard for cumulative damage. Routine disagreements became something else the moment they stopped being bounded by restraint. The sequence began with normalization of leverage. Measures that were once exceptional started to feel routine. Tariffs were no longer signals. They were instruments. Threats were no longer rhetorical. They were operational. Each move, on its own, could be explained as tactical. Together, they formed a pattern. This wasn't about correcting imbalances or settling a disagreement. It was about demonstrating control. And that distinction matters because control invites resistance, not compliance. As pressure escalated, assumptions on the Canadian side began to change. Policymakers stopped asking how to resolve the immediate issue and started asking what this behavior implied about the future. That shift is hidden in plain sight. Once disputes are interpreted as precedents rather than anomalies, they no longer feel temporary. They feel structural. A tariff today becomes a template for leverage tomorrow. A threat that works once becomes an expectation of repetition. At that point, the relationship stops being about the issue on the table and starts being about risk management. The next stage was institutionalization. What began as political maneuvering filtered into bureaucratic planning. Trade officials recalculated exposure. Energy planners reassessed dependency. Security assumptions were quietly stress-tested. None of this required public confrontation. It required spreadsheets, internal memos, scenario planning. The relationship was still functional, but it was no longer trusted. That transition is rarely visible, but it is decisive. From Washington's perspective, escalation was framed as strength. From Ottawa's perspective, it was read as unpredictability. That asymmetry hardened positions. When one side believes pressure proves resolve and the other believes it proves volatility, compromise becomes harder. Every concession feels unsafe. Every agreement feels provisional. The confrontation stops being about outcomes and starts being about insulation. The climax came when routine disputes could no longer be compartmentalized. Trade bled into energy. Energy bled into security. Security bled into diplomacy. Issues that once lived in separate lanes started interacting. That is the hallmark of structural confrontation. It doesn't require a single explosive moment. It emerges when pressures overlap and reinforce each other. At that point, walking back one decision does not restore the old equilibrium because the underlying logic has already shifted. What transformed routine disputes into something deeper was not intent, but accumulation. Each decision narrowed the range of future cooperation. Each escalation reduced the credibility of restraint. Over time, the relationship crossed a threshold where returning to baseline required more trust than either side was willing to extend. The resolution is not resolution at all. It is recognition. A recognition that what began as manageable disagreements has hardened into a confrontation rooted in altered expectations. This wasn't about a bad deal or a harsh negotiation. It was about a strategic miscalculation, assuming pressure could be applied without permanently changing how the other side plans, hedges, and protects itself. That miscalculation doesn't end with one administration or one policy reversal. It embeds itself in institutions. And once it does, the confrontation stops being episodic. It becomes structural. For decades, cooperation between the United States and Canada was not debated because it was assumed. That assumption was the invisible infrastructure of the relationship. It didn't need to be reaffirmed in every negotiation because it framed every negotiation. When disputes arose, both sides operated under the belief that alignment was the default state and disagreement the exception. That belief is now gone, and its disappearance explains more than any single policy shift ever could. This wasn't about ideology or personality, it was about predictability. Cooperation depends less on goodwill than on confidence that actions will remain within understood boundaries. Those boundaries began to blur. Decisions started to arrive without warning. Measures that once would have been preceded by consultation were announced unilaterally. Signals became noisy. Timelines compressed. From Ottawa's perspective, the issue was not pressure itself, but the uncertainty surrounding when and how it would be applied. Once uncertainty enters a cooperative system, assumptions begin to collapse. The progression was subtle. At first, cooperation slowed rather than stopped. Agreements were still reached, but they were narrower. Language became more cautious. Commitments were hedged. What had once been informal understandings hardened into explicit conditions. This is how mistrust grows in plain sight. Not through betrayal, but through recalibration. When each interaction carries a hidden risk premium, the relationship starts operating differently, even if the outward forms remain the same. The critical shift occurred when policymakers stopped interpreting American actions as situational and started interpreting them as strategic. That is the moment cooperation collapses into mistrust. Once behavior is read as systemic rather than tactical, reassurance loses its power. Every promise is discounted. Every concession is weighed against the possibility of future leverage. The relationship ceases to be cooperative and becomes defensive, not hostile, but guarded. That distinction matters because guarded relationships rarely return to openness. From Washington's vantage point, these actions were often framed as efficiency or resolve. From Ottawa's vantage point, they signaled volatility. That asymmetry hardened perceptions. When one side believes it is acting rationally and the other believes it is being exposed to arbitrary pressure, shared assumptions evaporate. Cooperation requires symmetry of expectation. Once expectations diverge, trust follows. The climax of this breakdown is not visible in headlines. It appears in planning documents, in risk models, in quiet diversification strategies. Energy supply chains are reassessed. Trade exposure is rebalanced. Diplomatic reliance is diluted. These are not dramatic moves. They are defensive ones. But taken together, they signal a decisive shift. Cooperation is no longer presumed. It must be proven each time. And even then, it remains provisional. This is where strategic mistrust replaces partnership, not because the countries stop working together, but because they stop relying on each other. Reliance is the true measure of trust. Once it fades, cooperation becomes transactional and reversible. That change is difficult to undo because it is reinforced by prudence. Every hedge that proves useful justifies the next one. The resolution is a colder equilibrium. The relationship stabilizes at a lower level of confidence. Interaction continues, but depth is lost. What comes next is dangerous not because conflict is inevitable, but because miscalculation becomes more likely. When assumptions of cooperation disappear, every action is read defensively. And in systems built on proximity and interdependence, defensive interpretation is often the spark that turns routine friction into escalation. The most deceptive feature of this rupture is how well the system appears to be holding. Institutions are still functioning. Trade is still flowing. Security coordination still exists. On the surface, the machinery absorbs stress and keeps moving. That absorption creates the illusion of resilience. In reality, it masks fragility. When systems are designed to endure strain without resolving it, pressure does not disappear. It redistributes. Institutional ties are doing exactly what they were built to do. They prevent sudden failure. Treaties, regulatory frameworks, and bureaucratic routines act as shock absorbers. They slow escalation. They create process. But they cannot restore trust once it has thinned. Institutions codify past assumptions. They do not generate new ones. When behavior shifts, the institution becomes a container rather than a corrective. It holds the relationship together, but it cannot pull it back to its previous shape. Economically, the same pattern holds. Trade volumes remain high, but their meaning changes. Flows persist because unwinding them would be costly, not because confidence has returned. Firms comply with existing rules while quietly re-optimizing. Supply chains become more redundant. Investment decisions prioritize optionality over integration. This is strain absorption through adjustment. It keeps commerce moving while reducing exposure. Over time, that adjustment hardens into structure. The economy adapts not to deepen ties, but to survive uncertainty. Security ties absorb strain even more effectively, and that makes them more dangerous. Defense cooperation continues because the risks of abandonment are too high. Intelligence sharing persists. Joint planning remains on paper, but confidence in automatic alignment erodes. Exercises become scripted. Commitments become conditional. Contingency planning quietly incorporates scenarios that were once unthinkable. The alliance still exists, but its assumptions are being rewritten without announcement. This is where the rupture deepens rather than heals. Absorbing strain allows actors to postpone reckoning. It buys time, but time is not neutral. During that delay, behaviors adapt to mistrust. Systems recalibrate around caution. What was once an emergency posture becomes normal. The longer this persists, the harder it becomes to reverse, because reversal would require deliberately increasing exposure again. Few institutions volunteer vulnerability. The climax of this dynamic is stability without recovery. Everything works well enough to avoid crisis, but nothing works well enough to rebuild confidence. The relationship does not collapse because collapse would be disruptive. It also does not repair because repair would require trust that no longer exists. This is the trap. Function replaces faith. Process replaces partnership. The resolution is structural stagnation. Institutional, economic, and security ties continue to bind the two countries together, but they no longer pull them closer. They act as braces, not bridges. The rupture remains contained, but it is not closed. And that is dangerous because systems that absorb strain without resolving it tend to fail later under different conditions and with far less warning. The phrase point of no return is often misunderstood. It does not mean hostility is inevitable or cooperation is impossible. It means the relationship has crossed a threshold where past assumptions no longer govern future behavior. The future will not be built on restoration, but on management. That distinction changes everything. From this point forward, the United States and Canada will continue to interact intensely but differently. Every major decision will be filtered through risk, not trust. Policies will be designed with escape routes. Commitments will be framed to minimize exposure. Alignment will be conditional rather than automatic. This isn't about punishment or retaliation. It's about self-protection becoming permanent. The most important consequence is institutional memory. Bureaucracies do not forget lessons learned under pressure. They codify them. Contingency plans become standard practice. Redundancies become doctrine. Over time, the system reorganizes around the expectation of instability rather than partnership. Even if political leadership changes, those embedded behaviors remain. That is why reversals are so rare once this stage is reached. The bilateral relationship will still function, but it will function thinner. Trade will continue, but diversification will accelerate. Security cooperation will persist, but assumptions of automatic alignment will fade. Diplomacy will remain cordial, but caution will dominate. This is not collapse, it is downgrading, and downgrading is harder to detect, but more enduring. The climax of this shift is strategic distance, not separation, but space. Enough space to maneuver independently, enough space to absorb shocks without relying on the other side. That distance reduces friction in the short term, but it also weakens the gravitational pull that once held the relationship together. Over time, shared projects become harder to launch. Shared sacrifices become harder to justify. The relationship stops generating momentum of its own. The danger lies in misreading this as stability. A relationship governed by calculation can persist for years without crisis. But when pressure eventually arrives, there is less elasticity, less goodwill, and less tolerance for error. Small disputes escalate faster because there is no reservoir of trust to absorb them. Misinterpretations become more costly. Coordination becomes slower when it matters most. The resolution is sobering. The point of no return does not announce itself with drama. It settles in quietly through habits and procedures that no longer assume alignment. What comes next is not a break, but a future defined by managed distance. That future is more brittle than it looks, because it relies on restraint rather than confidence. And in a system already under strain, restraint alone is a fragile foundation.